Whether you play Bedrock or Java, mastering fundamental skills can take your builds to a whole new level. So in this video, we'll look at a couple of builds from my creative world, see how I've applied certain skills pertaining to form and shape, and progress from a beginner level, and finish off looking at what an expert use of shape and form looks like. And so, starting with the basics, let's get right into it. To understand the very reason as to why shape is so important, just take a look at these two images. Yeah. So, with that out of the way, let's take a look at this very simple base of a house that I've got here, and let's see how we can make improvements to it. So, right off the bat, two easy improvements come to mind. The first is simply to extend the roof over the edge of our rectangular base, and the second is to simply divide the one rectangular body into two different sized ones. Already, we can see that this has made all the worlds of difference, and the reason is one key word: depth. Now, this can of course be taken a step further by pushing the roof back and even by including slots for windows. I'll show you some examples of builds I created, and although many have a lot of detail, I really want you to focus on the shapes of the builds for now. So this one here is a classic example of what I just showed you guys. It's a two-level build with a triangular roof, and as you can see, just by having these two different sized rectangles, it allows us to play with two different textures, one for the bottom part and another for the top part. The roof actually contains two smaller triangles in the form of these windows, which really add a really neat effect. Check this one out. We included these sticking out bits that also allow us to create further depth without having to fill out the entirety of the bigger overall shape. And you don't just have to work with triangular roofs. This one over here uses a much pointier isosceles triangle. And this one over here uses a domed roof, giving a much homier feel to it. Different shapes give off different vibes. So here we're starting to talk about something else which is quite important. Shapes and form allow us to build more interesting things. By being aware of how shapes play a role in our builds, we can utilize that to create things like this. So this was a house I built for a winter area that me and some server mates had. It was based off of some onion roofs that a lot of Eastern European countries have, and by simply slapping on a unique shape, it made the entire build a hell of a lot more interesting, even though, fundamentally, this is still just a two-level build with a roof. Though there are some details that I should mention. Check out the dentil molding of this house. By utilizing stairs and trapdoors, and you can also use slabs, I've created this mini dome effect that's pretty neat. Same thing with these fences and walls, which reinforce this curvature effect. Now, this can be applied even when the build isn't particularly interesting in shape. Check out the bank I built out. It's a nice build, but fundamentally it is just two rectangles. So let's see how I used shapes at a smaller level to make it more interesting. The sunroofs are really just a set of triangular prisms. A lot of the pillars you see are just very long rectangles, and these slabs that I use to divide the build vertically are just more rectangles, or in this case, kind of ovals, that I use to give the building more interesting things to look at. Now, of course, I went on to use stairs and slabs to give the windows more interesting shapes, but the point stands. Shapes, whether it be at a large or a small scale, can make or break a build. Okay. So, I've shown you some of the more basic things you should be aware of when you start thinking about shapes. But apart from depth and being interesting, one of the harder to tackle skills is that of non-symmetry. As humans, we tend to gravitate towards symmetry. We find symmetrical faces more attractive, symmetrical buildings to be pretty, and so forth. But being able to know when to break the rules allows us to build more organic and even realistic feeling builds. This town hall, which I must have built around 5 years ago now, is a perfect example. It's got its tall, towering clock tower to the right, and then a more robust structure to the center left. Now the build is not symmetric by any means, but it does give it a character that it wouldn't have if it were perfectly symmetrical. Now, in this case, the asymmetry arose out of necessity, kind of how like the British Parliament has a clock tower. Now, of course, this doesn't always have to be the case. Many a times it can be for purely aesthetic reasons. Take this wine house for example. It's meant to exude influence and wealth. It doesn't need this sort of tower part, but it does make you feel like the owner could spare the expense just to make their building more visible. Think of it as peacock feathers, if you will. One thing I do want to add is that depending on what architectural genre you're building in, you might inherently build with non-symmetry. I'll show you what I mean. These cyberpunk builds, or if you strip away some of the details I added, these brutalist builds are all asymmetric. They're all sort of rectangles eating into other rectangles. Now, they don't look lopsided, but they do give off this aura that one shape seems to be dominating the other, sort of like a hand closing over a fist. Being able to master this asymmetry can give you a lot more leeway when planning out your next build, especially if you're working with uneven terrain or some new build style. Alright, so we'll leave asymmetry for now to focus on the art of combining shapes, and to do so, we'll, a bit ironically, look at some of my most symmetric builds, starting with the central building right here. So I built this little replica just so that we can take a look at and focus on the shapes. You can see that what we're doing is simply combining shapes like triangles and rectangles to achieve the main body of the build. Everything else is just detailing, which, although important, is outside of the scope of this video. But you can see how from the pillars we try to make cylinders with walls to round off our block, and how for the windows we use the same techniques of using stairs, slabs, and trapdoors to make more interesting shapes. You can see how similar to the bank build, we use sandstone here to sort of separate our build vertically as well. Check my museum out. Even though it's smaller than the building we just saw, you can see that it actually uses even more shapes. You can see triangles built from slabs, and you can see how I use cylinders and domes in this build in a way that gives it an air of grandeur. The roof is actually quite interesting too. It's not a dome, but it's also not flat or triangular. It's this sort of in-between that just works. But again, at the end of the day, it's all just rectangles, triangles, cylinders, and some semispheres thrown in there. Alright, so we've touched on depth and creating interesting shapes. We've also talked about non-symmetry and combining shapes to create more complex structures. So now let's talk about something that can get a bit hard conceptually, but that really isn't all that bad and can make your builds look epic. And that's negative space. I'll show you what I mean. So this is a trestle bridge that I built a while back, and it looks pretty cool in my opinion. But it only works because the negative space that we have here is the correct shape. If I had tried to make it triangular, or say even rectangular, it simply would not give the same effect. Now, bridges are a great example because their whole point is to not have to fill out an entire section beneath them, and instead leave large negative spaces. But let's look at how it applies to buildings. Alright, so this nether station is an interesting study on outlines. You can see how we have this outline of trapezoids and rectangles, and I have applied them to our build to make it seem more robust and almost protected by this external cage. It is, after all, supposed to be in the nether, where it can be in a hostile environment. This is different to a building like this one, where we cut out into the build to give it a more interesting shape that allows us to do things that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do, such as giving it this kind of light pillar. And of course, in some cases, it also just allows us to use different architectural variables, similar to how building a two-story house allows us to use different building blocks. That negative space can, in and of itself, give us more opportunity to use different architectural styles. Now, I could go on with more examples, but I'll show you one more to exemplify one more thing. This is a dry dock with a submarine that's under construction in it. And I just want to use this to show that sometimes the build itself isn't a structure you build upwards, but one that you excavate out of the landscape, just like this inverted trapezoid built into this dry dock. Shapes are a fundamental part of building, and in Minecraft that is no different. Being aware of them when you build and thinking about your shapes can elevate your builds to the next level. I've been Tankfro, and thank you very much for watching.